A very, very warm welcome to everyone to the launch of the Handbook of Citizens' Assemblies, edited by de Gruyter and edited by Reuchamps, Julien, Vrydagh, and Yanina Welp, with 29 contributions from authors from all over the world. We're very happy to discuss with you this handbook today, to go into the discussion of some of the core concepts, and of course to celebrate its publication. Our event today is co-hosted by the Centre of Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra and the Democracy Research Unit at the University of Stuttgart. A special thank you to Ferdinand Sanchez, the research assistant in Canberra, who's making this event possible, making sure that you can see and hear everyone. So thanks so much for all that preparation. We're very happy that so many of you are here to discuss with us, and as I've already mentioned, to celebrate with us this very, very impressive and rich handbook, where I also have to say I was incredibly impressed by the broad reach and wide array of contributions that it brings together. It has empirical and theoretical perspectives, looks at citizen assemblies around the world and in different democratic regimes, discusses their potentials and their shortcomings, both micro and macro processes, and also looks at how citizen assemblies might be interconnected with other forms of participatory processes and governance. And I think that also explains perhaps a little bit of the broad interest in the audience here today, because I think it is a handbook that's really of interest to anyone researching on participatory governance, democratic resilience, and democratic systems as a whole, because it goes much beyond just talking about citizen assemblies. So a warm congratulations to the three editors in particular, and also to all authors and contributors, many of whom are here today. A wonderful job, and thank you for putting together this handbook for all of us to enjoy and discuss, not just today, but surely for many years to come. Since we have many people in the audience who are themselves very well-versed and interested in citizen assemblies and probably have many questions and concepts that they want to discuss, we thought we would spend about half the event going into the handbook and discussing some of the concepts with the editors and contributors, but then also make sure that many of you get the chance to ask questions and make comments. So please feel free to already keep those in mind for the later open part. For the beginning of this event, we will begin with an outline of the handbook by the three editors, who will introduce us to their motivation, to the concept, and to the structure of the handbook. And we will then have a short panel with our editors and with two contributors, Vaughan He and Nicole Corato, where we will discuss some of the concepts that are central to the handbook. So we will go into tensions of citizen assemblies, expectations and effects of citizen assemblies, citizen assemblies in authoritarian regimes, and citizen assemblies in the public sphere. So all of these are topics that could be events in their own right, of course. So we'll try to really give a brief, compact overview just to inspire some debate, and then turn to the audience for questions and comments. So for now, I welcome our three editors, Reuchamps, Julien, Vrydagh, and Yanina Welp, for an introduction to the handbook.
Thank you very much, Franzi, and good day to everyone. Very pleased to see so many of you joining for this book launch. When you saw the invitation, you could have said, well, again, a book on citizen assemblies, one of many others. To be fair, the idea of the handbook did not come from us, but actually from the publisher, the Gruyter, who wanted to invest into the field. We will mention that there is also a launch of a new series by them. But the invitation to do or to prepare such a handbook came in a pretty right timing for us, because we were involved, as many of you, in a cost action constitution making in the democracy at the time, which had the benefit to bring two things. One is quite a few people, but another is money. And this money served to make this book open access, which is a good news, I guess, for all of us. But also we wanted, since it's another book on a given topic, we wanted to make it a bit different. And above all, we wanted to move beyond the usual suspects, and so to go outside of the West. But I will give the floor to Yanina to mention this.
So yeah, good morning, or good afternoon, or good night to everyone. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Francisca, for your introduction, and thanks Nicole Curato and the Center in Canberra for hosting this event. From my side, I would like also to thank my co-editors, Julien and Min, for inviting me to join this amazing, I would say, process of working on this handbook, which, as Francisca said, has 29 chapters, 27, and the introduction and the conclusions, and a collection of 43 authors from many different countries. For me, and I would like to mention that I jumped into this without an expertise on sorted citizens' assemblies. I had a concern on that. And Min and Julien said, that's why we want you, because I had more like, let's say, general focus on participatory democracy, institutions of citizen participation in different places in the world, but not on sorted assemblies. And this is not the main focus of the book, despite there are many chapters discussing that. And this is, I think, one of the original contributions of this book. We approached the topic considering the current trends. Sorted citizens' assemblies are spreading around the world. This is more than evident, and probably most of the people joining this event is aware that there are more and more sorted citizens' assemblies being activated in Western countries mainly, but not only. But we wanted to go beyond that, because citizens' assemblies, in a more broad definition, Julien will go in depth on that, have been present in different places for a very long time. So we wanted to consider this as a general framework. And then, also as said by Francisca, we wanted to discuss theoretical approaches, which I think are more common in the literature, but also to take into account more empirical research on outcomes, evaluations, proposals to integrate and resolve some of the main problems of citizens' assemblies. And also, just to mention something I think is quite interesting and relevant in the book, is a trend in the spread of citizens' assemblies. Everybody, mainly in the academia and maybe in the advice sector, is talking about that, but we still don't know much who supports CAs. And in our book, for instance, we have several chapters dealing with what civil servants think about the CAs, what the general media, what we know about the general media, the general public opinion, also how the media is taking this topic into account, and also the combination between CAs and populist leaders, what populist leaders say about CAs, when they support it and when not. And also, just to mention one more example, what the civil society organizations think about citizens' assemblies. In this sense, I would say that it's really one more book on citizens' assemblies, but it's a quite complete overview on what we know till now, leaving many open questions. And in this sense, I would like also to stress that our intention was to cover the debate. So there is no one single message, but a complicated one. There are people who is more against sorted citizens' assemblies. There are people who is more in favor. Some scholars are looking for solutions. So it's really, I would say, a quite complete picture of where we are now with this discussion. And yeah, I will leave the room to Julien.
Thank you, Yanina. Thank you, Franzi, as well, for the nice introduction. I will now share a PowerPoint Voila. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, good. Thank you. So basically, let me first present the book series, which is also organized by the Gruyter and edited by Stephen Elstup from the University of Newcastle. So basically, Stephen is editing this book series on citizens' assemblies and mini-publics. And the Handbook of Citizens' Assemblies is the first book appearing in this series. And now Stephen is calling for a book proposal. So if you have any ideas about the manuscript, about the internal or external dimensions of citizens' assemblies and mini-publics, don't hesitate to send him an email with your ideas. And then in the next part of the presentation, I will give a broad overview of the content of the handbook. But before I do so, I will define our concept of citizens' assemblies. So here we define a citizens' assembly as a process that includes a diverse group of lay citizens who engage in deliberation on a public issue so as to exert a public influence. And so the novelty about this definition is that we do not mention random selection. And why we did so is so that we could include cases beyond the West, because most citizens' assemblies in the West have stratified random sampling or random selection, but in the rest of the world, that's often not the case. And so we wanted with this handbook to broaden the scope and the debate about citizens' assemblies. And that's why we mention the idea of an inclusive group of citizens, because in a way you can find other strategies so as to gather a group of diverse citizens. So that's about the definition, which is developed in the introduction of the handbook. In the first part of the handbook, we invited theoretical contributions. And as Yanina said, there is already a plethora of theoretical papers and books about mini-publics. So here we really try to have like original theoretical contributions. And we did so with 8 chapters. And we can have first a group with 3 chapters that discuss key concepts that are commonly associated with citizens' assemblies, such as representation. We often speak of descriptive representation in mini-publics, but Mackenzie also discusses other types of representation that can be instantiated in citizens' assemblies. And then there is also the concept of accountability. We often hear that we cannot hold the citizens participating in citizens' assemblies accountable. Well, Pierre Van Damme discusses different strategies to hold citizens' assemblies as an institution or its participants accountable. And then the final chapter in this dimension, it's one that discusses the various criticisms that we hear about citizens' assemblies. And then they discuss under which conditions citizens' assemblies can actually cope with these issues and still make democratic contributions. Then a second group of contribution in the part 1 is about connecting citizens' assemblies to the political system and the broader public sphere. So Brigitte Geisel discusses different ways through which we can connect citizens' assemblies to policy-making processes, while Christina Lafont discusses the idea of empowerment. How can we empower citizens' assemblies through their institutionalization? And finally, Nicole Corato and John Rowntree wrote a chapter about how citizens' assemblies can contribute to the broader public debate and make contribution for the broad public sphere. And finally, we broaden even further the scope with 2 chapters, one in which Antonin Lassalle-Webster and Mark Warren discuss basically how the concept of a citizens' assemblies within the theoretical approach of the problem-based approach to democracy. And that's interesting because they discuss basically the different democratic practices of a citizens' assemblies in relation to the other democratic practices and institutions that we can find in the political system. And then finally, John Boswell, Caroline Hendricks, and Selene Erkan discussed the concept of democratic mending, which they developed in one of their books. And they basically seek to integrate citizens' assemblies within that concept of democratic mending. So that's the first part, theoretical perspectives. In the second one, we discussed the implementation of citizens' assemblies through different angles. The first one is a chronological literature review of the crisis of democracy and how different types of citizens' assemblies, how different models have been proposed as solutions to different periods of crisis that democracies have faced. Then we have also two chapters about the combination. We have one chapter about how citizens' assemblies can be used as a complement to direct democracy, that's written by Nenad Stojanovic. And then we have a chapter about the use of citizens' assemblies at the supranational level, especially at the level of the European Union and at the global level. And then we also have a chapter which I co-wrote with my colleague Louise Knops about climate assemblies. We often hear about the benefits of using citizens' assemblies to help tackle climate change. And with Louise, we actually disentangled the problem of climate governance to see how citizens' assemblies can help tackle specific problems inherent to the climate crisis. And then we have two really original chapters about about citizens' assemblies. The first one is the recent cases of combining lay citizens with elected officials in citizens' assemblies. And so the Irish stellar team of Clodagh Harris, Jane Souter, and David Farrell discussed the latest examples of mixed member citizens' assemblies, and they discussed the pros and cons of combining these two actors in the process. And then we have a chapter about citizens' assemblies and children. So as you all know, children are often absent in citizens' assemblies, often for legal reasons. And Kei Nishiyama discussed different strategies through which we can actually include directly or indirectly children in citizens' assemblies. And then the final two chapters in this second section, the first one is about the top-down or bottom-up character of citizens' assemblies. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach? And finally, we have a chapter about the different uses of citizens' assemblies at the local level in authoritarian regimes, namely Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And then we go on to the part 3, which is about the assessment of the various contributions of citizens' assemblies. A first chapter written by Didier Caluart and Reuchamps sets a golden standard for the survey to evaluate citizens' assemblies from the perspective of its participants. And then in the second chapter, we have Marina Lindell that discusses basically all the effects of deliberation and information provision within a citizens' assemblies on its participants. And so she discusses the epistemic transformation, the opinion changes, and so on. And then with Saskia Goldberg, we have a chapter that basically discusses the effects of citizens' assemblies on the broader public, on the broader population that does not participate in the mini public. And then Elisa Massard and Vincent Jacquet discuss the various policy impacts that citizens' assemblies can have. So citizens' assemblies do not only seek to have an uptake of its recommendation, they can also have different types of influences on policy making. And so they basically proposed three different impacts, and they discussed the various methodologies in order to assess them. And then a final very interesting analysis is made by Baogang He about the use of citizens' assemblies in authoritarian regimes, at the national level. And that's a very interesting discussion because because it discusses the different degrees of empowerment in citizens' assemblies in Libya, China, and Cuba. And so for the final part, basically there we try to bring to see how citizens' assemblies are perceived through different groups and in different fields and literature. So first, David Taluchter and Jean-Benoît Pillet discuss the extent to which citizens in general support the idea of citizens' assemblies. And so they relied on surveys made in 15 European countries to see to which extent citizens like the idea of citizens' assemblies, if they do, with which degree of empowerment. And then we have another chapter with Christophe Nissen about how elected officials perceive citizens' assemblies and which factors can explain the negative or positive perceptions. And then we have also a chapter about public servants' perceptions of citizens' assemblies, written by Jean Bottin and Alice Mazot, in which they also elaborate a typology of different profiles of public servants and how they relate to the positive and negative perceptions of citizens' assemblies. And then the final 3 chapters basically look at citizens' assemblies from different literature. So we have Andrea Felicetti discussing the literature on social movements and the concept of citizens' assemblies to see to which extent social movements can actually build beneficial relationships with citizens' assemblies. And then Christoph Jacobs discussed to which extent populist citizens participate or not in citizens' assemblies and how do they perceive their own participation in these deliberative processes. And finally, we have a chapter from Rusile Maya about the citizens' assemblies in the literature on communication studies. And so here she discusses the connection between citizens' assemblies and the broader public sphere and the media system to see how we can better connect citizens' assemblies with the rest of society. So that was a brief overview of all the chapters. I thank you very much for your attention and I look forward to your questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much to Min, Yanina, and Julien for this introduction and overview of the handbook, which I think again underlines the broad agenda of the handbook and I think makes all of us very interested and excited to get into reading it. You've probably all heard now in the introduction that the handbook is open access. Vrydagh has posted the link to the handbook already, so you're very welcome to go ahead and download it or download individual chapters. So we will now go to a brief discussion with our speakers before opening the floor. And I would start with a question for Yanina, who writes a wrap-up chapter to the handbook that's titled Citizens' Assemblies Beyond Utopian and Dystopian Approaches. And I think you've outlined already in the introduction, Yanina, that you really tried in the handbook to bring together different perspectives. So both those who are enthusiastic and hopeful about the potentials of mini-publics, but also those who want to shed light on some of the potential shortcomings or things to keep in mind or potential dangers. And in the introduction to the handbook, there's Julien outlines the really widespread idea that mini-publics, or citizen assemblies, as you call them in the handbook, pose a potential for strengthening democracy by strengthening participation, legitimacy, and democratic resilience. You've now pointed towards that perhaps there are also some dangers or shortcomings in seeing citizen assemblies in that way. Could you explain a little bit what some of the pitfalls might be on that perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Francisca, for the question. I think it's one of the questions which are crossing the whole handbook. I mean, you can read through these questions, the different chapters. And in my view, and let me say a few words and provide an example. Part of the challenge, I would say, that the CAs are facing now is that for some scholars and advisors, CAs are identified as a kind of direct or magic solution to the deficits in terms of participation, legitimacy, and democratic resilience. And the problem, I'm not against CAs, and this is clear in my conclusion, but I have a clear doubt on assuming that this could be a direct outcome. And I think several chapters show to what extent this is the case, and particularly the empirical research in some cases. In terms of participation, part of the problem is that CAs engage a small group of population. And if we talk about CAs in the way that are spreading in Latin America, maybe this could engage more people in participation because it's more open format, etc., etc. And of course, there are many discussions if you follow this line. But if we take sorted citizens' assemblies, we are talking about a very small group. And some people say, well, if we implement that constantly, at the end of the day, many people will participate. But even though when we think in big countries, the amount of people participating will be quite low. And in any case, there are more problems attached to that. One of these problems, for me, quite key, and is shown in the chapters, is that the general public, with few exceptions, doesn't know about CAs. So it's more, to implement more CAs, is more a claim by some scholars and by some advisors than a claim made by the general public. So we have a problem there. And I think it's a fundamental problem, because if we expect to democratize society implementing a mechanism which is not requested by the public, is not very democratic, really. So I think there are more actions which should be taken into account before just spreading more and more CAs. A second point is related to legitimacy. And in this sense, I think there is an example, which is not a sorted citizens' assembly, but is an assembly which recently worked with a lot of independence, which is the Chilean Constitutional Convention. The Chilean Constitutional Convention had high legitimacy when it started, of course, was elected, and again, it opens room for a lot of debates, and the Chilean colleagues are studying that in many interesting ways. But the point I want to raise here is that legitimacy is not something that a mechanism of citizen participation will provide by default. So a citizens' assembly could work and provide legitimacy or not. And it depends not only on the model in which it works, I mean, the institutional design, but also on politics. And I think the idea of promoting CAs like from a laboratory is one of the main challenges, or maybe directly, I would say, a mistake, because the people should be engaged also in the decision of to what extent this is the solution for democratic pitfalls. We have very interesting cases. In Ireland, this is working really well. And I mean, really well means well, of course. There are also some deficits, but there are very good outcomes. But in general, the evidence we have is that citizens' assemblies are quite unknown by the general public, are not really launching massive process of participation, and also are not really efficient in terms of changing the policy making. And that's my concern on this wave of, asking for more and more citizens' assemblies before really dealing with some of these deficits and before improving also the institutional designs.
Yeah, great, wonderful. I think that outlines many of the discussions also in the book about how to connect citizen assemblies to the public, how to increase their legitimacy, and also how to connect it to politics and policy making, decision making, etc. And on that, there are also many points in the handbook. Julien, now in the introduction, outlined the 3 core principles that the editors have outlined for citizen assemblies: deliberation, inclusion, and public influence. And I think that particularly this criteria of public influence as citizen assemblies are being implemented increasingly more and more in different contexts, as Yanina has said, is also gaining a lot of debate, and there's a lot of discussion about what public influence should mean, what successful public influence of a citizen assembly can look like. So Julien, perhaps you can give an insight there on what public influence means for a citizens assembly and what makes a citizens assembly successful in terms of public influence.
Yeah, sure, Franzi. So basically, the argument is that without any public influences, citizens' assemblies end up being some sort of experiments without really practical use for solving democratic problems. And also, if you organize a citizens' assemblies without any public influence, basically it boils down to the activation of citizens. You know, we activate them, but we don't empower them in any ways. So public influence is a broad term and it encompasses a lot of different influences, but I think one of them is very crucial, not only for the success of citizens' assemblies, but also for their credibility and for the sustainability of citizens' assemblies on the longer term. And that influence is the influence on public policy, on public decisions, the extent to which citizens' assemblies successfully shape to some extent public decisions. And that's very important because for participants, they will not be interested in participating in citizens' assemblies if the process is not supposed to have some sort of impact on public decisions. And that's something we could have read in the study of Vincent Jacquet about why citizens do not want to participate in citizens' assemblies. One of the main reasons is because they do not expect impact on public decisions. And so that's very important. And also, if you involve citizens in a process that does not have any public influence, then it generates a lot of frustrations among participants, and then it backfires. But that's not only about participants, also about the broader population. If the population sees that there is no impact after a citizens' assemblies, it will also increase political dissatisfaction. And there is on that a very interesting study by Lisa van Dijk and Jonas Lefebvre. And they basically say that citizens perceive a decision-making process as legitimate if there is a mini public in it, only to the extent that there is an uptake of the recommendation. Without any uptake, basically, it just further widens the gap between citizens and politics. So that's very important. And then also about the credibility on the long term. If we organize citizens' assemblies without any impact, then basically they will be perceived by the population as part of the problem. You know, they will be associated with the status quo, with this existing political system that suffers, that receives a lot of criticism from the population. And so it's really important for citizens' assemblies to have an impact, to see that they can create and provoke changes, because otherwise, on the long term, they will just end up being associated with the existing political system, and I'm afraid they risk losing their really genuine democratic potential to generate public decisions that can receive a broad public support.
Great, thank you very much for outlining that. I think with that, we've heard from Yanina and Julien already some of the big criteria and questions for making citizens' assemblies successful. There is also a lively discussion already in the chat, which is wonderful. Vaughan, for example, has recommended a book on deliberative democracy in Asia. And in the introduction, our editors already outlined that they wanted to make a particular effort with this publication to also look at cases of citizens' assemblies around the world that go beyond the West, etc. And Vaughan here has written a chapter on one of these cases, a particularly interesting and perhaps also controversial one, namely citizens' assemblies in authoritarian regimes, where he focuses on the examples of China, Cuba, and Libya. But we will now hear from Vaughan a little bit about implementing citizens' assemblies in the context of authoritarian regimes. And there, Vaughan, there are perhaps some people who are doubtful about whether citizens' assemblies have equally great potentials in undemocratic regimes, are doubtful about the contributions that they can make. So with your chapter in mind, perhaps you can give us an insight there into why is it worth, what are the benefits of organizing citizens' assemblies in non-democratic regimes, and what can we expect from them in those contexts? I think you still have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you for offering me this great opportunity. I would like to emphasize a few points. The first point is that I have a feeling, strong kind of feeling that Western political theories or democratic study should have a moral obligation to study the conditions that enable some progress, some like the partial empowerment developed under authoritarian regime. I see that this moral obligation is for me, we just good stuff like citizen assembly have some democratic effects. You cannot just need also look at the other societies, how other peoples, in particular people under authoritarian regime, can benefit partially, some partial benefits. So if we only focus on the Western society, I think it's too narrow. And I strongly believe, say, if we have a refrigerator, we have an internet or mobile phone, then those things should be equally distributed to the rest of the world. So similarly in political science, when we discover a good mechanism, good institution of citizen assembly should be equally distributed to the rest of the world. So my paper is to try to kind of first attempt to study those three countries, China, Cuba, Libya. Definitely you're right, it's controversial. Some countries do not have any empowerment, but China does have empowerment, partial empowerment. So my focus is look at the condition and what kind of conditions that lead to this kind of partial empowerment. Come back to the Julien earlier his points. He said citizen assembly need have an impact. Otherwise, people are skeptical. And this exactly happened in China when the local official organized those public forums. The peasants don't bother to turn up if those are empty talk, because they need a half day to go to market, earn some money. So they need to see result. So it is under market pressure. The government have to make those forums meaningful. It's really citizen voice does have some partial input. So come back this so that's the first point I would like to say this. We have a moral obligation to study those citizen assembly and authoritarian regime, despite they are a lot imperfect and symbolic, sometimes manipulative. But still we need to do that. So my second point is that when we study those citizen assembly, the assessment criteria should not come from the democratic. We need take into democratic theory, democratic criteria. But another most important criteria from my perspective is compare with the past and the present. If the current practice of citizen assembly improve a little bit, and if we compare past practice, they improve a little bit, they're better than past, then we should be convinced it's worthwhile to do so. So we should not look at this from another criteria immediately that this does not fit is a democratic criteria, is a meaningless. Now that's too easy to say. It's too easy to do. But in the authoritarian regime, you need a small motion, slowly improve the system. So those people walk on the ground, they will find a lot of resistance. So they have to walk very slowly. So that is I think the most important point is that look at this criteria, practical criteria. So how they improve the certain aspect better than the past practice. So it's kind of historical comparison. I think is so this help us put on the roots. So that's the second point. The third point I want to make the kind of how do we see like China, Cuba currently they both have introduced a certain maybe other people will call it a manipulative, symbolic, or consultative practice. So there are, I think there are three perspectives. One is dismissive. As long as those holding authoritarian regime, those practices cannot be trusted because there's a top-down political control. They are completely manipulative, symbolically, and nothing we can learn from it. So I disagree with this kind of simplistic dismissal attitudes. I prefer this different perspective. The second perspective, which I think is important, is I call the progressive, deliberative authoritarianism perspective. So that is recognize some the democratic value of the citizen assembly. They are where we should confirm or even praise a limited progress. They make progress, but there are a lot of deficiency. But then I think they just come back to my early points, compare with the past, whether they make a progress. If they make a progress, then we should study how do they achieve that? What is the conditions still block them to do further progress? So I think we need to study this progress, slow motion. Come back to the Julie's earliest point, the impact. I have a best example when I do the deliberative participatory budgeting in China. So first time their local officials don't release the budget item information to the participants. Then participants complain, you can't ask us to talk about budget. We don't know what's the budget. So they have to release first the 4 pages, but then the participants the next year they complain again. 4 years we only know a little bit, not enough. Then next time they open the 64 pages, cover most the budget item. So they year by year, then they make the progress. Then the further progress. So when they give this budget information to citizens, so what's the impact? So then citizen impact the next year, they should have a report. What is the result of the deliberation, citizen assembly? Then they have another report. So here around the 5 or 6 years, they slowly and kind of make progress. So my final points, I'm sorry, I take a bit of long. Treat those authoritarian states like China, Cuba, as a laboratory of social sciences. When we do that, we needed to do a science of citizen assembly. Those are laboratory. One deviate case that help them develop a true political science of the citizen assembly. Sorry, I take a long time.
No worries. Thank you very much, Baogang. And we even got a little bit of a disco atmosphere towards the end of the comment when the light went off.
Yeah.
Very useful, I think, your comment for systematizing also a framework for understanding when citizen assemblies in authoritarian regimes are symbolic and manipulative, as you say, and when we can actually see them as progress and useful. So we've talked a lot now already about the involvement of the public, the empowerment of the public in the context of citizens' assemblies and connected to citizens' assemblies. And the second contributor that we have on our panel today is Nicole Curato, who has co-authored a chapter on citizens' assemblies and the public sphere with John Rowntree. And yeah, now very often we've focused on this connection to the public in the discussion already with a strong look at mainly legitimacy. And in your chapter, you have perhaps a little bit a broader outlook where you view citizens' assemblies also as an opportunity for capacity building and meta deliberation. And perhaps you could outline a little bit the conditions under which that is possible and under which citizens' assemblies can initiate a debate in the broader public sphere?
Yes, thank you, Francie, for the question. And first of all, congratulations to the editors. You have my deepest admiration, not only for putting together a thoughtful lineup of chapters, but also for such service to the deliberative democracy community. And I think this is something that I really like about our community. Our intellectual work has community generating power, and I'm pleased that we're all here to celebrate that. So the lead author of our chapter is John Roundtree. John is an assistant professor of communication studies in Houston in the US, and his work focuses on citizens' initiative reviews. And to answer your question, Francie, there are two ways in which citizens' assemblies can instigate public deliberation. I'm sure there are more ways, but in our chapter, we focused on two. First, we argue that CAs can invite public deliberation. So we use the examples of the British Columbia as well as the Ontario citizens' assemblies, which included public hearings and written submissions as part of the design. So in this sense, connecting to the public sphere was front-loaded in the process. It's not just the group of people in the citizens' assembly that get to have input or listen to experts, but citizens in the wider public also get to shape what is going on in the deliberations within the mini public or in the citizen assembly. But we also know that CAs can also trigger deliberation as it happens or after it concludes when the wider public sphere debates on the assembly's recommendations. Second, we also discussed how CAs can trigger meta-deliberation, which means CAs themselves can become the subject of public deliberation. And as we know, some citizens' assemblies can be quite controversial, and public debates about the legitimacy of the CAs, the proper role of CAs have in decision-making. All of these, we argue, are important conversations that polities need to have. So in that sense, this is a form of a meta-deliberation because we are deliberating on how we organize our societies and how our deliberative processes should be organized in the wider deliberative, if not political system. And I think this is an important discussion, especially in polarized societies that are looking for innovative or non-traditional forms of doing politics that can break the deadlock in these polarized societies, so to speak. So overall, the key argument of our chapter is the importance of connecting CAs to deliberations taking place in the wider public. It's not a substitute for it. I really caution people who equate deliberative democracy with citizens' assemblies. That's not the point. Citizens' assemblies are micro-political forms of deliberation, and deliberative democracy necessarily involves the wider public sphere. So I think I'll cap my comment there. There's more to say about the book, but I'll cap it there for now.
Super. Thank you very much, Nicole, for outlining that super important connection, which maybe also later on people will have some questions about. We are about to open the floor, so feel free to put up your hands. I've seen already there are some questions also in the chat. As you are ready, or as you are getting ready to do that, perhaps one final question for Nicole, who has written so extensively throughout her career on citizens' assemblies, to give a broader perspective for the wrap-up of this panel. In what ways do you think the handbook reflects prominent changes in the research around citizens' assemblies, and perhaps also in how far do you think it sets an agenda for the future of important discussions that are to be had?
Yeah, I think what I really appreciate about this handbook is it's not a sales pitch. It's not a marketing enterprise for citizens' assemblies. It's in many ways, it's a polyvocal book. So as Yanina mentioned a while ago, it invites a debate to demonstrate where we are now. So for example, my colleagues here in Canberra, Selene Erjan and Caroline Hendricks, together with John Boswell, they have a chapter that argues that there are instances when we don't really need to design institutions of democracy, but to mend them. And that does not involve citizens' assemblies necessarily. Stephen Elstov and Zora Koban have a chapter identifying the critiques on CAs and how these critiques can be addressed by a more systemic approach. I also appreciate very much the bold way in which Julien wrote the introduction, challenging impressions that citizens' assemblies are Western constructs, and Bao Gang already talked about this. That introduction's language, Julien, is so assertive and so provocative, which I really, really like. I think he was citing the work of John Keane, where Julien challenged the common narrative that the birthplace of sortition is Greece. But actually, according to archaeologists, models of assembly-based democracy can be traced to what is today known as Syria, Iran, and Iraq. It traveled to the Indian subcontinent until it traveled to Greece, right? So why do I find this inspiring? I think it's inspiring because in the past couple of weeks, I've had various calls, discussions with development agencies, international organizations, NGOs that want to promote citizens' assemblies in the majority world or in the global south. And I always get asked the question, is there resistance in the global south because it's a Western import? People might not like it. And in response, I always quote this youth leader that I met in Southern Philippines who told us, we've been doing this for a long time, but now it has a name. And you called it deliberative democracy, we called it something else. So I think just to wrap this kind of response to your question, I think my reflection here is where the field is and where it's headed, and how this book beautifully set it up, is that before we have the audacity to think that we are promoting democratic innovation in different countries, particularly in so-called deficient democracies, I suggest we approach this from the perspective of intellectual humility, as well as intellectual curiosity, as Vrydagh beautifully pointed out. It's our moral obligation to study authoritarian societies as well. And what other traditions of deliberative practices have long existed in communities that have long been multicultural, multi-ethnic, before the West has become multicultural and multi-ethnic, hence the need for structured forms of citizen deliberation. And I think this should be an agenda that must be taken seriously, because if we don't, citizens' assemblies will just be another conditionality tied to development aid, like what we learned from development studies circa 1990s. And Franzi, I know the 90s are back in terms of fashion, but hopefully not in terms of tactics of democracy promotion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicole, for that inspiring wrap up with a shout out to 90s fashion. And thank you to all 5 speakers for your insightful comments, and I think raising all of our appetite for digging deeper into this book and the discussion. We would now welcome any questions, comments, from the audience. Please feel free to use the raise your hand button in the chat if you would like to ask your question. And I can also read out questions from the chat if you feel more comfortable writing them there. You can also address questions to particular speakers. I think in the interest of time, we will have always one person responding. So if you already have someone in mind, we can do that. And there are already 2 questions in the chat that I've seen. The first one, I think, relates to Yanina's comment. So Esteban writes, going back to Yanina's comment and also connected to the idea of regional handbooks on citizens' assemblies, how does the book address severe inequalities in societies and their influence on citizen assemblies, particularly on inclusiveness and the deliberative quality of citizens' assemblies? So I think another really important central question. And perhaps after this, you can follow up with a response to a second question by David, who asks, is it essential that the outcomes of citizen assemblies always go to referendums? Otherwise, the general population will regard them as just another privileged group with a hidden method of selection. So perhaps one of the editors could take each of those questions to kick off our question round. And there's, of course, also a question for Nicole, where's your WAM shirt? But perhaps we can settle that in the chat. So Yanina, Julien, feel free to take one of those questions. Perhaps Yanina can start with the first and Julien Armin with the second. I think we have trouble hearing you, Yanina. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, Esteban questions is a very good question. We don't have a specific chapter addressing how inequalities are addressed by CAs. Yeah, in fact, I think this is one line of research we should develop more. So that's the question. No, we don't have this. But I would like to also maybe add to what Nicole said, which I fully agree, that one concern emerging from my experience working in the book and with the current conversation on the global spread of CAs and related to unequal societies is to what extent the discourse and a critical discourse in favor of spreading CAs could feed authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes, mainly, who are weakening electoral democracies. And in this sense, I'm thinking particularly in cases such as El Salvador in Central America now, where the electoral democracy system is weakening by the president. And I think the discourse in favor of CAs, and particularly sorted CAs, could feed an authoritarian discourse. If there is an idea that CAs are more democratic than electoral democracies, could be really dangerous, because CAs are easy to control. And I think this is quite obvious. We can go in depth if there are doubts on that, but it's quite obvious that CAs could be easily controlled. So a critical discourse in favor of a model of CAs to replace electoral democracies could be really dangerous, particularly in unequal societies. And then a second point, which is not addressing the question, as I said, we don't consider these questions in the chapter in the book, is related to authoritarian regimes. Vaughan spoke about the Chinese, Libyan, Cuban case, and we have another chapter dealing with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And I think it's also interesting to see that really we want to take into account what is going on in authoritarian regimes. The parter point is that authoritarian regimes also need to build legitimacy, first point, but also need information to improve governance. And it's interesting to see how, at least in what Vaughan describes for the Chinese case, the citizens' assemblies are working to improve governance there, while in other cases, such as, for instance, Cuba, are just instruments of legitimation outside the country, because are not really mechanisms to improve governance. So we also have a lot of diversity in authoritarian regimes, which to somehow, what I want is to confirm that we really need to take into account what is happening in these countries with this kind of deliberative experiences.
Great. So I guess we have also a little bit this outlook that we look a lot at global inequalities, but perhaps Esteban's inequality question is also one for a future research agenda that we can focus on a little bit more.
So may I answer the second question, Franzi? Yeah. So, and I will also quickly go back to the first question about tackling severe inequalities. So we do not have like a specific chapter on that, but we have a couple of chapters that try to discuss this question, and basically how citizens' assemblies try to cope with inequality in society is mainly by the selection methods. Most of the time it's via random selection with stratification. So basically we will add criteria so that we can recruit people from the more marginalized groups of society. But even though with these techniques, it's not always sufficient, because people still have to accept to participate. And when they accept, it's often because they have an interest in politics, even though they belong to more to groups that are more excluded. So sometimes we use financial incentives so that we can increase like the interest in participating in citizens' assemblies, but that's not the optimal solution. There is still a lot of work to do about which other methods can we use so that we can recruit people that belong to these excluded group. So that was my take on the first question. And then about the second one, is it essential that the outcomes of citizens' assemblies always go to referendums? I wouldn't say it's always essential. It's a great way to enhance the visibility of citizens' assembly, which is one of the main shortcomings of these deliberative processes. But that's not the only way to create visibility for citizens' assemblies. So, for instance, to take a case that I know quite well in Belgium, so you have deliberative committees organized at the regional level in Brussels, and there you have a petition system, so citizens can propose topics that the deliberative committee will deliberate on later. So that's a way to generate visibility, but that's not enough, again, as we can see with the deliberative committees that have been organized so far. You need more than just like creating the options. You also need basically media coverage. You need like public visibility. And something that was quite interesting with the G1000 in Belgium that happened in 2011 is the role of influencers. It's old school influencers. They're not like on TikTok. They were like David van Riebeeck, like thinkers. And basically, David and his colleagues participated a lot in the public debate so as to advertise the citizens' assembly. And that had a huge effect on visibility. But so we need to think about ways to increase the visibility of citizens' assemblies. And if we can organize referendums, that's perfect. But that's also only one stage of policy making process when we make decisions. What about agenda setting on when we need to formulate different policy options? Do we also there need a referendum? I'm not so sure. We may need other mechanisms to make sure that citizens' assemblies become more visible and are not like, I don't know which, are not perceived as a privileged group with a hidden method of selection, that the citizens' assemblies are also owned by the rest of the population because the rest of the population knows about the process and can engage with the deliberation of citizens' assemblies.
Perfect. Thank you, Julien and Yanina. We have a question from Hugh Pope. Feel free to unmute.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And what a wonderful book. I'm so excited to dive into it. It looks like really great work. My question is, as someone who sometimes writes about the more popular, for a more popular audience about citizens' assemblies, I'm stuck with this number of nearly 600 citizens' assemblies held until the end of 2021. Could I just ask all those who worked on the book, is there a new number? Is that now that this OECD database doesn't appear to be being updated, what number can we use? What is the number of countries where citizens' assemblies have taken place? And does this new definition mean that there's just going to be no way of keeping track with that overall number, because it seems to be now a very large group potentially? Thank you.
Perfect. So we have, I think, two questions in there. What about what statistics can we use to say how many citizens' assemblies happen? And I think also a little bit perhaps explaining your definition. Will it make it more difficult to actually keep track of citizens' assemblies or to define them or categorize them? So I think it's a question for one of the editors, whoever you feels like it. Julia, go ahead.
I already spoke a lot, so if Min and Yanina wants to jump in, please feel free. But I would say about the database and listing all the citizens' assemblies. Here, it may be useful to go back to the distinction between mini-publics and citizens' assemblies. You may want to, if you want to conduct research on mini-publics with only like the random selection as discriminatory criterion, then it will be fine. But the idea of the citizens' assemblies is more to include, cases beyond the West. And yes, the consequence is that we will have more cases. But in the first time, it's important that we also include these other world regions in the debate, and making like database, it will be like a step in the future, a next step. But it's very first important to be more inclusive in the way we research citizens' assemblies. And I'm sure in the future, people will take up the challenge of listing all the citizens' assemblies in the rest of the world. Participatia is already busy building this database. So yeah, that would be my answer to your question. And about the latest numbers about citizens' assemblies and mini publics, I don't know if there is an update, but about Belgium, I can tell you that we have more than 60 cases so far. And also when we compare the database we have on Belgium and the ones from the OECD, we see that Belgium had much more cases than what the OECD found. So maybe the number found by the OECD is an underestimate of the actual number of citizens' assemblies. And then if we include also the cases without random selection, then we have even more cases, with maybe a good news in the end.
Maybe just to add to the second part of the question, I think it of course is a bigger number, but doesn't complicate the counting, because as Julien said, we have in our broad definition of citizens' assemblies, different mechanisms which could be also easily identified. So we are talking about, for instance, participatory budgeting, in which also there is an instance of meeting for all the citizens participating. We are talking about conferences of public policies, about neighborhood councils, about sectorial councils, and there are different databases. For instance, in Spain, Joan Font has a huge database, and his team in IESA, on how it works in Spain. So we can follow different strands to arrive to the general number or to take the specific. Now, the Atlas of Participatory Budgeting covers what is about participatory budgeting. Then conferences of public policies are quite well covered for Brazil, for instance. I think Palesca Lima is also.
It seems that Yanina has disconnected. Valesca Lima is making a database on Brazil is the last thing I heard. But I think we have a few examples then there of databases. There are also some resources in the chat to perhaps look at for such databases. As there are no more open questions currently, we can perhaps return to a comment from David on the question of random selection, who wrote that stratified random selection will be a mystery to most voters who are already suspicious of politics being in the hands of a few privileged people. So perhaps there is a question around, can we explain the idea behind random selection better and make clear why actually we do this? Or do we take more the approach that you've taken in your book to say, well, random selection can be a tool, but doesn't have to? And since Nicole reacted to the comment, perhaps you have a thought on this comment. If not, maybe one of Min or Julien, since Yanina seems to be offline, can comment on how to deal with random selection, how to explain it, or can we just say, well, maybe it's not that important anymore?
Nicole, you want to go first?
No, but I can if you don't want to go first.
No, I think it is indeed a random selection is a bit of an intellectual idea, but on the other end, I would say it's also a game changer. It's a different way of doing politics, and I guess we all know that random selection is not the ideal solution. Is maybe the less worse solutions when you want to get involved people. I mean, also people in inequalities to give them the best chance to participate. But we also know that it's not because you invite someone that the person will come, and we need to work on this. But at least in quite a few Western democracies where election is still the primary element, random selection can be seen as a bit of a game changer and changing the dynamics. And in this, I think that's positive. But of course, we need to make sure that, sortition is used properly and that we don't sell it as the perfect idea. On the other end, I mean, in most countries, we've been using election for 2 centuries at the max, or maybe 100 years. So, I mean, and today, I mean, sortitions in citizen assemblies or in many publics, it's only a couple of even maybe not so decades. So there is a learning process to go through also, of course. So we should give time to random selections as we do for elections, which are not perfect today. But maybe Nicole wanted to jump in now.
Yeah, actually, I mean it when I put a heart on this question, because one of the most, maybe, yeah, indeed, suspicious part of citizens' assemblies is especially the citizens' assemblies that have sortition, because I know you have a broad definition in this book, is how opaque sortition processes are, right? Like they're usually done by either market research firms, or if I'm not mistaken, in the case of Ireland, they already have a more established database such that they don't have to outsource it anymore. But the entire process of random selection typically happens behind closed doors, in the same way that survey firms, polling companies do their stratified random selection behind closed doors as well. And obviously, a lot of polling firms are facing the same issues of, are you polling correctly? Are you sampling people correctly? So maybe instead of just putting the burden of answering this question to the editors, I looked at the list of people who are present on the screen. There are a lot of people here who have an applied experience of running, implementing, evaluating citizens' assemblies. So maybe we can, sorry to kind of jump in here, Franzi, but maybe we can like brainstorm together with the ways in which sortition has also evolved to become a more transparent process, such that David's concern about how some people can be suspicious and how opaque it is, how that suspicion has been addressed, increasingly being addressed, if there are moves in countries or localities to make sortition more transparent and accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone from the audience would like to comment on this or to return to this, please feel free. I mean, there's also very many of the wonderful authors of this handbook in the audience. So also more generally speaking, if you would like to make a comment about perhaps something that's in your chapter, or outline other ideas that you think would be important to cover, please also feel free to raise your hand. And there is now a comment from David, and then another question by Magni in the chat. So David, why don't you go ahead, and then we will go to Magni, who's also asking about sortition.
Yes, thank you. Just to follow up on Nicole's comment, really, it still troubles me an awful lot that we've all got used to one person, one vote. Now, whatever the cynicism around that, and there is a lot of cynicism in the UK as to whether that actually works because of our electoral system and so on. Nevertheless, it is a very powerful idea that every person has equally one vote. And it troubles me that although I'm a great believer in citizens' assemblies, the method of selection will be people will be very suspicious about it, as though it's a fix. You know, it's certain people. Why am I not chosen, etc., etc. So my question, I have a question actually. Is there any research into the reaction of the general population in places where citizens' assemblies have been run, the reaction to this idea of choosing certain people? You know, do you sort of trying to say, do we know what the reaction of the rest of the population is to this process?
Can I say something to address these questions? So we don't have an academic study on this issue, but I do know how local official responds to this question, their strategy. So, say examples in Zeguo Township, they use a random selection method. Randomly select 280 citizens from out of more than 100,000 population. Then the local official immediately face a challenging issue. The only 0.02% population are selected, what about rest 99.8% of citizens? Their voice should be matter. And if they complain, how we deal with this issue? So the local officials face this challenging issue. So what they do, they invent several strategies. It's quite fascinating. One strategy is that they different from the random selection method, which would require when you random select, you only look at those individual examples. So follow this statistics requirement that if you random those selected people, they only speak themselves. That's it. That will truly represent whole the sample. But against this statistics principle, local official insist each random selected people must visit 10 family household and talk with them, connect the opinion. So in that case, their opinion, their voice represent a wide community. So that's one strategy. Then the second strategy is that so in the end of the day, when they have a result, so when they want to, still people have a different opinions, different view. So in that they do a little bit like they don't do like the referendum, like we call referendum. What they do, they have a piece of paper, a form, ask each one. In particular, that's the case in the village. Ask each citizen, fill that question, make their choice. So we can interpret as a referendum. So in that way, they get all the people's opinion on with regard to specific issue. Then they found out which item got a majority support. Then they pass it.
Great, thanks, Wolfgang, for those examples. We also have received some examples in the chat. So Paulina Popieszna, for example, writes that in Poland, citizen assemblies spring up like mushrooms, even in a right-wing populist context. So that's interesting news as well. And she says that the process of random selection is transparent and made online, so everyone can watch this process of random selection. And Ben Ersilis says the same thing about Brussels, where the sortition process is also live streamed. So that seems to be another solution. And we had one further question on this stratified selection debate by Magni, who did ask if random selection is an ideal, which Ming, you've already now talked about, if it's an ideal to strive for, or kind of the pros and cons of random selection. And she also asks, did you consider using or broadening the definition of mini publics rather than making a new definition for citizen assemblies, I guess is the question. So Min or Julien, perhaps you can address that.
Yeah, thank you, Francie. So the reason why did we consider broadening the definition of mini publics instead and sortition as the ideal goal? Basically, what I want to say on that is theoretically, you could make the argument that pure random selection is the best way because then everyone has an equal chance of being selected in the mini public. And then you could also make the theoretical argument that you may not have a good descriptive representation of the whole population if you just rely on pure selection. And so you need stratified random sampling. And both arguments are really valid by themselves and very valuable. But the issue, and to go back to what Yanina said earlier in the presentation, is that we basically implement mini publics based on normative theory. But it could be very interesting to actually ask citizens which kind of selection methods they would prefer. We could create an experiment in which we ask, okay, you have one mini public with pure random selection, another one with stratified random sampling, with a stratification based on socioeconomic factors and or also political preferences, and then one with more active method of recruitments, for instance, going door to door to recruit the people, and then ask which kind of which selection method is the more legitimate to the citizens. That would be, for me, the right way to approach this question, instead of making theoretical arguments, which in the end are quite good, but what do citizens think about it? That would be my take on it.
Wonderful. Yanina has also typed her response, which I think I will read because her connection was...
I will try, but I think I'm connected, but I don't know what happens with my connection. Now, the point I wanted to raise is about the transparency, because I think there is a general idea of the desirability of transparency, full transparency, and we should consider also some negative aspects. I'm not against transparency. I'm just saying that absolutely full transparency in the process of deliberation could be also prejudicial, preventing some people to express their opinions if they are not sure, preventing, in some way, modifying the process of deliberation, which could be maybe more friendly or open mind if it's not full transparent. So maybe it's good to think in kind of moments in which people could just tell what is going on, previous agreement on the assembly, and some moments in which deliberation could be at closed doors. And in saying that, I'm based theoretically on what Elster said for the constitution-making process in general, and again on the Chilean case, which where transparency affected quite a lot negatively the legitimacy of the assembly. So I think there is a point there.
Super. Yeah, that's a very interesting discussion that I think now we've looked at many aspects of. Since there are currently no further questions, perhaps we can have a little wrap-up round. We are approaching the end of the event, where perhaps all of our speakers, we've heard now so many difficult, controversial discussions in the area of citizen assemblies that many people are working on. Perhaps you can outline just for you what you think is the most, or the most central, one of the most central, maybe is easier, one of the most central questions for the research agenda on citizen assemblies at the moment. There are many people in the audience who are working on this issue, so perhaps to poll, to brainstorm some ideas on what are the questions that you think would be really interesting to focus on, to do more work on in the future, and to perhaps also cooperate on a little bit more. And I warmly invite anyone in the audience, we have so many authors here who have thought extensively about this topic as well, to also write your response to that question in the chat. So what do you think is the big topic that perhaps you yourself would like to work on, or that you think would be interesting to resolve or to have more discussions on in the area of citizens' assemblies? Just checking if there is a future, if there are further questions in the chat, but it seems the random selection question is triggering a lot of discussion, so I think we can probably already add that to our list about the legitimacy of random selection, right? The purpose of random selection, and also about transparency in the process of deliberation in citizens' assemblies. What's its purpose and what are perhaps also its pitfalls? Yeah, but what do you think? Why don't any of the speakers, you're welcome to just take the floor if you have a response at hand.
I'll shoot first. Julien, you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Min.
First. And then you say that, well, citizen assemblies, and we've been also touching this a bit, is that what is really tricky and paradoxical is that on the one hand, we need those who hold power today to use them, but on the other end, we don't want them to use them. And so that's very much this question of how do we articulate it with those who hold power today. I mean, we want to change the system for most of us to some, or improve it. And then we have gatekeepers, officials, typically the elected officials today. And so we want them to be in favor of citizen assemblies, but we don't want them to be too much involved into them. And so that's something very tricky, because other people could say, well, actually, what we really need to go is bypass elected officials. So that's a bit where I would say, as practitioners and election activists, we're in the middle of the river to some extent of what to do. So that would be my contribution.
Yeah, on my end, I think for the future research on citizens' assemblies, it could be very interesting to see how these micro deliberative forums can actually contribute, or maybe not, to macro democratic functions. Because now when we discuss and describe in the public, it's often in the narrative of the crisis of democracy, which is a structural issue that representative democracies have. But the question is, okay, we know citizens' assemblies can make endemic contributions about one specific policy-making area, but we don't know yet to which extent they actually contribute to macro function, which are basically the functions that are needed to tackle the structural issue of the democratic malaise. So how can we spot the causal mechanism of citizens' assemblies that contribute to these broader democratic functions? And that's not only actually a research agenda about mini publics, it's about the broader democratic systems, how specific democratic practices and institutions can actually contribute together or individually to the broader democratic goods.
Perfect. Yanina, perhaps if you can hear.
Yeah, I agree with Julien and Min. So I think this authoritarian deliberation should be part of the research agenda. Then the dimension of legitimacy, which I think we have to distinguish between an external attribution of legitimacy based on theoretical assumptions and the building of legitimacy empirically. So we need to deal with both. Because the second question, the second part, the empirical assessment is quite fundamental now. And then how to connect with policy making. This is a general trend, and I think Julien's chapter and his co-author on climate change is quite key on that. There is an expectancy on CAs and their ability to resolve the climate change problem, but these are two different things. One is how to build legitimacy on the agenda of change, and the other is how to implement this agenda and how to take decisions on that. So it's a quite complicated task, and I think some part of the debate is simplifying the thing. The idea is that just by activating a citizens' assembly on climate change, the problem will be resolved. But we have more than enough evidence showing that most of the decisions taken are quite generalistic or are not applied. So we have to resolve this part too. And I think the agenda would go through this.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that outlook. Vaogang and Nicole, if you have a very brief response, I think we have time to hear those as well still. So perhaps Nicole and then Vaogang.
Yeah, for me, my main interest now is how we can tell plausible stories about citizens' assemblies. From where I stand as an academic, I think the evidence is quite mixed, right? And that's why all the systematization of evidence, I think, is a move from a scholarly and I guess a practice perspective. It's very important. I very much support the advocacy going on in promoting citizens' assemblies and testing these experiments, but I also want these stories to be grounded on empirical evidence, because where we are at the moment is we don't know enough yet. So how can we tell a good story about citizen assembly, but not overselling or overclaiming what it can do without robust empirical evidence yet? So I guess that's my call out for everyone on the screen. How do we build this story together?
Thank you. For me, the most important issue is to how and to what extent citizen assembly can address the practical issue. really solve some of the practical issue. So this is the most important issue, rather than to meet certain idea of abstract idea, but whether you can address specific practical issue. The other issue I think I want to think is how AI has kind of impact citizen participation. Already impact our academic life, but also impact the government official decision making, their view about citizen assembly, and also how citizens impact citizens, their usage system. So the point sometimes AI already provided you some solution to specific issue. Why you still need this citizen assembly? This is a challenging issue. Then, of course, I think this authoritarian, citizen assembly is still important issue.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those responses. I think very inspiring for all of us who do research on these topics to go ahead and address all of them, of course. I would like to wrap up with another very warm congratulations to the editors of the handbook and to all the contributors. Thank you all for coming and celebrating with us, and go ahead and download the handbook, and hopefully we will continue the discussion in many other places in the future. So thanks everyone for coming, and have a great remaining day.